Welcome to Environmental Law course, and dear learner and viewer, we are going to discuss the environment protection in India planning and policies. As we have seen that we have discussed the environment protection in Indian planning and policies, specifically devoting to the question that how right from the first to the 12th plan and the Niti Aayog's finding and devotion to the India's environmental crisis and environment protection strategy and the sustainable development have been one of the major focus, which not only talks about the social justice and equality, but it also talks about the eradication of the poverty, the nutritional security, the food security, access to safe drinking water, and so much so that the entire spectrum of the India's planning and policy, which we have noticed in the previous lecture, reached resulted into a kind of a system of economic growth with environmental protection by eradicating the poverty, by controlling and stabilizing the population and promoting the sustainable use of the resources, and in a true sense to herald a kind of the equitable society and that informs the social justice among all the institutions and at the same time maintains the ecological harmony and the balance and the sustainable development. In this lecture, my dear learner and viewer, we would like to see that how these policies and planning have been very effective in matters of the specialized planning, meaning thereby the 5-year plan should be taken as a general planning and the centralized planning in India. And we were trying to explore that how India's 5-year plan have adequately addressed and what pitfalls and promises it has tried to see and remedy and correct and rectify. Now we will see that the entire spectrum of India's environmental protection policies and plan, we will be devoting the environmental policies per se, meaning thereby we will be discussing the environmental policy relating to mineral policy, forest policy, national agriculture policy, water policy, forest policy, and then we will try to see that how these policies goes well into promotion of sustainable development in India and what are the major shortcomings of these policies and how we can better hone out our strategy to craft more and more policy which can see that India's developmental process is inclusive of all the broad object of the environmental policy and sustainable development. Let's begin with the entire synopsis of the lecture that we see that India's environmental policy have adopted major key policies, and that major key policies happens to be the national water policy, the forest policy, mineral policy, and the national agriculture policies. They were all has been declared by the India and documented by the India in right from 87 to 2000, meaning thereby in the last 15 years of the last century has witnessed the major promulgation and specification of the environmental policy. All these policy broadly encompasses that to ensure efficient resource base, resource use, biodiversity conservation, and the pollution control and the community participation in India's sustainable development. The first and the foremost is the national water policies, which emphasized that the water is very precious natural resources, and it advocates and articulates that how the national water policy in India, which have been promulgated in 1987, can integrate a sustainable management of the drinking water, the irrigation system, the energy requirements, the hydroelectricity generations, and while maintaining that whatever has been the water demand, that how the use and the management of the water resources, the use of the water resources can be fostered without disturbing the balance of the hydrological cycle and maintaining an ecological balance and sustainable development. Then we will be discussing about the National Forest Policy 1988, which tries to preserve ecological stability through afforestation, biodiversity conservation, and active participation of the local and the tribal community in the forest management system. And then how the National Forest Policy 1988 and its subsequent amendment to the policies have been one of the most important policy in touching a vast area of the forest resources, because we have seen in the last lecture, and you may rightly and vividly recall, that the colonial India's environmental policy, or we can say the legal history of the environment and environmentalism in India, primarily rotate around the forest policy. Now, the question is whether these national forest policy in India witnessed and very prominently and very luminously try to see a clear departure from the colonial legacy of the forest laws and policy, or the National Forest Policy 1988 try to be a kind of a continuum. We will be discussing that aspect under the National Forest Policy of 1988. We will also be taking note of the National Mineral Policy and how the National Mineral Policy, as we have seen the colonial mineral policy, which adopted for the massive extraction of the coal and the coal mining and the mica mining, taking as a mining as a private activity and taking mining as a kind of a license and lease system. Now we will try to see that how the mineral policy is a kind of a shift towards privatization in mineral exploration, or it is going to be a kind of a nationalization of the mineral resources. Then taking and critiquing the national mineral policy to see that how we can have been more emphatic in the environmental safeguard and intergenerational equity to balance the economic growth and ecological protection under India's national mineral policy. Then we will be looking at the National Agriculture Policy, and here, dear learner and viewer, you can easily recall what we have discussed about the India's plan and policy, especially regarding the Green Revolution, which were heralded in the fourth five-year plan, and the 10 district as a pilot project was taken into consideration to foster food security, the nutritional security, and as well as having promotion of sustainable agriculture to create and to rectify and to remedy the entire question of the poverty and to feed the growing population, and at the same time to keep the very identity of the land and the land management intact in matters of the soil, and the salinity of the soil must be maintained so that it can be used to see that the food policy and the environment policy, especially the national agriculture policy, should require soil restoration, should require efficient water resources, should also be devoted to agroforestry, and how in the entire Indian notion and concept of the traditional knowledge system and the modern environmental practices, how these two can be combined into India's national agricultural policy and to promote sustainable agriculture. And then we will be looking at these policy primarily, and one the water, another is the forest, another is the mineral and the agriculture policies. Looking these four policies, which are very fundamental to the environment protection and sustainable development, what we wish to do to see that to move from the general perception of India's policy and planning to the specific policies and planning, to establish that how the Indian government, state, and the entire governance system has adopted and tuned to the basic and broad objective of the sustainable development. Dear learner and viewer, we start our discussion for the National Water Policy 1987. The National Water Policy emphasized primarily on the use of the water being a prime natural resource and as well as a basic human right and a very precious national asset. So the three objectives which has been mentioned in the National Water Policy 1987 is very important, is that it is prime natural resource. Therefore, when we talk of water, the common perception is that the water is without a cost, and we have seen the crisis of the internalities of the economics. Most of the economic theories do not incorporate water, costing of the water, as one of the question and one of the sector which requires an attention to see that it is a prime natural resource and should be internalized into the internalities of the economic theories, not to be treated as externalities because of the denudation and degradation of the water resources continuously. It should also be taken as a human need and the basic human need, because so far we did not find any kind of an alternative to the water. We can have alternative through many means, by the food, by the drugs, by the medicine, but so far as the water is concerned, we have yet not found any kind of a replacement and substitution of the water in human life, and that's why we say that the water is elixir of life. When we see it is the elixir of the life, then it speaks volumes about it, and then how it is a basic need, how it is a prime natural resources, that has to be realized for and the foremost. And then only we can see that any country, which has been endowed with the water resources is a country which is very rich, and it carries a great national asset and the wealth. That realization has been given by the National Water Policy. And here it needs to be mentioned that the water is not only a kind of a national asset, but I can go a step further to say that water, as has been mentioned by many, that water is a metaphor of power. That any country which which possess and endowed with massive water resources, it happens to be very powerful. And today, if you look at the global scenario, we will find that the countries which are having the scarcity of the water and the country which are having inadequate water resources, then there are countries who are fighting on the water, and there are water wars and the water sharing, the water wars, and water has been one of the most important subject of the conflict at the international level. The water sharing, the water crisis, water distribution, and many of the countries in the world we see are fighting on the interstate river sharings and indulge into some kind of water wars and water diplomacy. What is the thrust of this national water policy is the fact that it not only declared is a prime natural resources, it not only declared it is the basic human need, it not only says that it is the elixir of the life, it also say from the state and governance point of view that it is a very precious national asset. It is a kind of a metaphor of the power, and the countries which have more water resources is considered to be more powerful. And thus the National Water Policy 1987, having identified the three basic postulates of the National Water Policy, has stated water as a resource which is indivisible, and it says that the Indian water and the national policy, which depends upon the rainfall, rivers, surface, lakes, and groundwater, all are part of the one and the same system. Here, your attention is drawn to the fact that in India, we have a traditional water harvesting system. Vis-a-vis, we have the dependence on the monsoon, and then we have the river system, and we have abundance of water by the ponds, lakes system, and the aquifers and the groundwaters in India is also one of the major sources. From this point of view, we have to plan the environmental policy or the water policy in such a way that water is considered to be a part of the larger ecological system, and it is one of the very pivotal element of the environmental policy that should be taken very seriously. And in this sense, we see that the fundamental values of the water should be realized, and as well as we should see that how the assigned values of the water is to be taken, and then we should also see that what is the governance system, and then the entire landscape of the water governance and the valuation of the water is something very important, that it should be there should be a proper valuation, there is a proper pricing of the water resources. Water should not be taken as priceless, although water is a priceless entity. If we don't have water, even the massive pumping of money will not generate water. So whatever water resources we have, we must have a water policy, we must have also a water polity, and we must have a water politics, in the sense that the entire water governance system is based on the valuation, the pricing, the governance related values, the fundamental values, the assigned values. All these things must be part and parcel of the national water policy as a matter of concern, as a matter of prescription, as a matter of urgency. Then from this point of view, when we look at one of the major features of the national water policy, then we have to adopt a kind of a strategy. The one is the strategy of what is the practice and the policy, and on the other hand, what is the information and the knowledge system. And then we have to adjust accordingly by a kind of a feedback system to make the National Water Policy 1987 a workable, a pragmatic, and a real water policy. So let us look at the features of the National Water Policy. The features of the National Water Policy, as it has been stressed upon and stated upon, that the major crisis is the drinking water supply, meaning thereby the potable water is a major challenge. And despite India is endowed with great water resources, the challenges of the drinking water supply is very formidable and very challenging to us, because the both rural and urban population, with 25 to 80% sanitation respectively, we see that the goals of international drinking water supply and sanitation development decade have not been fulfilled. And then it needs that any kind of a national water policy should directly address to the question of the drinking water, to the question of the potable water, because in many of the judgment, specifically Atta Khoya Thangal versus State of Kerala, this is a case on the point, and the Joshi versus Municipal Corporation of Agra, where right to potable water has been declared as fundamental right. So the judicial exposition of the water needs as a human need, elixir of the life, basic human need, is being judicially recognized, and therefore we should in the national water policy spectrum, we should be devoting to the question of drinking water supply and sanitation program, because the drinking water and the sanitation go hand in hand. That's why we see that the Wahab principle, which was adopted at the World Summit on Environment and Development, it talks water and sanitation. Though the focus is the water, but the water and sanitation is supposed to be the integral part of it. And that's why 1981 to 1990 decade, which was observed as internationally, has given focus. And in the same decade, we adopted in 1987 the National Water Policy to ensure there must be adequate drinking quality of the water, there should be improvement in the quality of water, and there should be efficient technological application of the water. We should also improve our information system of the water and share the knowledge, be that the modern knowledge, be that the traditional knowledge regarding the improvement of the water system. Then we improve the water system, information, knowledge sharing, and as well as we must have an adequate resource planning about the water. In this way, we can bring the availability of the water resources of the country within a massive span of the population, and by utilizing the resources and maximizing the planning for hydrological unit. So the utilization of the resources is also important, because many of the water resources in India remains underutilized. Even the states in India which have been bestowed with major resources is facing flood, facing drought. So it means that there is a real crisis in the entire spectrum of the policy debate and the policy prescription. So the utilizable resources is also very important, and the maximization of the hydrological unit and its optimum capacity is also important in the entire discussion of having adequate water supply or the features of the water policy of 1987. In this way, we see that all these features were well attended in the national water policy. It talks about multi-purpose projects, which have multi-purpose means that it may have drinking, it may have irrigation, it may have the electricity generation. So all the multi-purpose policy should not be only commercial, but at least the multi-purpose water project should have this drinking water supply as a primary concern. If you look at the Narmada Dam project in India, the major concern was that whether the damming of the Narmada in Maharashtra, Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh ensures an uninterrupted water supply to the general masses, the general people of all the four states. So is the case of all multi-power projects. So the National Water Policy 1987 is giving a kind of a priority to the drinking water as a primary concern. The features of the National Water Policy 1987 should also give effect to the last and the least, meaning thereby those who are living in the tribal area, those who are living in a hilly area, who are living in a far-flung area which are not directly and very adequately connected, must that all socially disadvantaged group should also have the access. It should not be only an urban phenomenon, the rural phenomena, but looking at the vast chunk of diversity in India and the needs and the geographical distribution of the people, that water as a basic human right needs to be realized by all kind of the people without any kind of a discrimination. And it requires periodical assessment of the groundwater resources, because where there is no riverine system of the water distribution, then we have to depend on the groundwater and aquifers. It should be charged and recharged constantly, and at the same time the overexploitation of the water resources, the ground water resources, to be avoided, so that there should be a continuous and the perennial supply of water, because most of the rivers are in our country who happens to be the perennial rivers are no more perennial. So the excessive dependence of the groundwater resources here also, we should not have indiscriminate pumping of the groundwater resources and over exploitation of the resources, and it requires an integrated and coordinated development of the surface water and the groundwater. So we must have a twin policy of the surface water one and the groundwater on the other hand, to see that they are conjunctive, they are coextensive, and then we can envisage a system of the right from the very project planning to the ultimately the assessment of the planning and the end of the project planning, that these considerations must be visited, reviewed, and re-reviewed and revisited. So broadly speaking, that the feature of Water Policy 1987 talks about drinking water, it talks about irrigation, it talks about hydroelectric power, it talks about navigation, it talks about industrial and other uses of the water, and there should be a judicious approach to all the needs, whether it is drinking water or the irrigation water or water for hydro purposes, or it is for the navigational purposes, or inland water, subterranean water, and the water which has been used by the industry, that must be have a kind of an integrated approach. And then the features of the Water Policy 1987 also talks about the participation of the people, participation of the stakeholder, be that farmer, be that scheduled caste, be that scheduled tribe, be that any kind of the area, people who are living in a far-flung area. And then we must be very particular in matters of distribution and collection of the water rates. That is something very important. And to create a kind of a consciousness and awareness about the conservation of the water resources, and then we should be having a kind of a foolproof plan for the flood control. So the flood and drought both go together in our country because of paucity of the water. So one is the paucity and one is the plenty. So we must have a kind of a careful planning under the broad umbrella and the rubrics of the National Water Policy 1987, and then we can say that any national water policy, as happens to be 1987, it requires a kind of a commitment and development and maintenance of all hydrological cycle and hydrological resources and water resources. It should also chalk out the principles and objective to promote the goals of sustainable use of water across all the users and the producers. Then, dear learner and viewer, we will be devoting to the aspect of the forest policy of 1988. Here it remains to be said that prior to 1988 forest policy, we had a forest policy of 1952. This 1952 forest policy was severely criticized by many because of the fact that this policy was too myopic to the forest conservation, and it was also a kind of a policy which were a kind of a colonial continuum of the policy. Therefore, this policy have been criticized, and it is because of this policy and its colonial hangover, the forest in independent India, which was 36% at the time of independence, came to 11%. It is this realization that the forest policy 1988 was drafted. And this policy tries to entail the ecological balance on the one hand. It talks about conservation of biological diversity on the other hand. It talks about soil and water management. It talks about the rural and tribal population. And it talks about the efficient utilization of woods and the environment of the people. what have been the skewed approach of the 92 forest policy that has been corrected by this policy, and we see the broad goals of this policy is ecological balance, biodiversity, soil management, water management, because the water is also dependent on the forest. Therefore, and to see that the rural and tribal population and the efficient utilization of the timber, wood, forest resources are to subserve the greater common good of the people. Dear learner and viewer, the broad objective of the forest policy has been the maintenance of environmental stability through preservation, increasing substantial forest cover in the country, meeting the rights and concession for the requirement of fuel wood. That means what is minor or what is major forest produce, and to see that how the tribal rural populations requirements are met. It talks about the productivity of the forest, and it also talks about the utilization of the forest produce by encouraging diversion of the forest land for non-forest purposes. This is some of the very critical issue which has been litigated in law, that earlier in the 1952 policy, the forest was a state subject, but it was in 1976 it was brought to the concurrent list, meaning thereby the state has diverted the forest land for the non-forest purposes and industrial purposes. That's why this policy talks about the great losses which has been done by this policy of 1952 are to be reclaimed by compensatory forestation, forestation, and wherever it is possible to have afforestation and reforestation and compensatory forestation, because the impact and denudation of the forest resources from 36 to 11% are to be reclaimed and recompensated. The forest policy 1988 also talks about the communitarian rights of the local community and the usufruct schemes which were already prevailed by the people and have enjoyed the usufructory rights by the local community in matters of the minor forest produce, their entitlement. It also talks about to resort to tree farming and crop-based farming. It has given adequate attention to substitution of wood, not as a sense of the energy. The wood is not only the source of energy, but we should shift the source of energy from the wood so that the forest resources, the timber resources are not to be exhausted. It also talks about the forest-based enterprises. It has given attention to the forest produce for industrial consumer and as well as the true market value of the forest produce by involving local people and the grassroots non-governmental organization for creation of a land bank for compensatory of afforestation to again redirect the same aspect that which we have already missed upon in the last, that is diversion, which has been taken very indiscriminately by the state, because forest being the state subject, the state has been very callous in granting lease to the forest land for non-forest purposes. To that end, we must have a compensatory forestation. And then with this, we find that the forest policy 1988 is a departure, what we can say, from 1952 forest policy, which were having a colonial gloss. That gloss and that facade is being tarnished by this forest policy to see the afforestation and giving more attention to the sanctity of the forest resources. With this, dear learner and viewer, we will move to the mineral policy 1993, because the mines and minerals in the colonial India we have already seen. Let's see that how independent India has a major shift of the mineral policy being in public sector, not in private sector, and how from private sectors it can go to the foreign investor. to increase efficiency, investment, and output. It also talks about the short-term profits. It also talks about unregulated exploitations that must be seen in a very critical manner, and we have to be very careful and circumspect in this policy to the serious environmental damages which has been accrued by the faulty mineral policy or unsustainable mineral policy, such as deforestation, pollution, and land degradation, because any mining happens to undermine the environment and the ecology. Therefore, therefore there must be a strict environmental safeguard and effective regulation. That has been the major focus of the 1993 mineral policy. The major objective of mineral policy in 1993 happens to be a kind of a policy of identification of the mineral wealth on the land and the offshore, and to develop mineral resources taking into account the national and strategic considerations. And that national and strategic concern should devote to the question of the present need and as well as the future need, meaning thereby the intergenerational equity must be taken into account while looking at the mineral resources and exhaustion of the mineral resources, extraction of the mineral resources. We should have to more careful concern for the intergenerational equity, and only then we can minimize the adverse effect of the mineral development in matters of deforestation, in matters of pollution, in matters of land degradation, and then it requires a very effective protective measure that is to be incorporated. And then the mineral policy is really trying to see from unsustainable mining to a more sustainable mining and intergenerational principle, and a safe mining's extraction has been devoted by one of the major objectives of the mineral policy 1993. We can have a look that how mineral concession, improvement, sustainable utilization, improvement in the life, and then development of mines, mineral specific strategy, how development of short, medium, and long-term demand, then how to import, substitute, and value addition and export, and how we can better conserve the mining resources is the element of this policy which the mineral policy 1993 has been very circumspect and careful in devising ways and means. Lastly, we'll be discussing the National Agriculture Policy, which dates back to 2000. Then we see that right from the Green Revolution to the National Agriculture Policy, the agriculture policy have seen that the policy document has set the growth rate of 4% per annum food production, which is technologically viable, environmentally viable, economically sustainable. So we have to see that the agriculture productivity, we should not be excessively devoted to boost the agriculture productivity, but we must see that whether it is environmentally viable or not, and for that it had said 4% of the target. It also talks about reclamation of the degraded and fallow land, which have been the result of high yielding varieties of the seeds and excessive use of fertilizers and urea. So, reclamation of the fallow and degraded land, and then the soil and the salinity must be very productive. It has adopted watershed basin, and it has given a special attention to integrated and holistic development of rain-fed areas, as well as try to see that how surface and groundwater supply can be made to all agricultural land, so that the farming community with their environmental concern can lead to not only sustainable agriculture but agroforestry, social forestry, and then it can also employ the traditional practices and knowledge and wisdom to harvest the sustainable agriculture goal. So, this national policy on agriculture is one of the most important policy because agriculture, mines, mineral, water are some of forest are some of the major areas which governs the entire spectrum of the environment protection policies, planning, and then when we had a discussion on the environment policies in India, then right from we should take a different kind of a perspective from the India's integrated 5 years plan system than that of the system what is called to see that how sustainable development are more visited in the 5 years national plans in India, or we can look at the actual planning and policies, which is environmental policies in matters of water policy, forest policy, mineral policy, and agriculture policy. Thus, my dear learner and viewer, in this lecture, we have emphasized 4 areas. The one is water, another is forest, another is mineral, another is agriculture policy, to reflect upon the fact that how India gradually moving from general environmental policies to specific environmental policies to promote the goals of sustainable development. With this, I think that this lecture will at least give a very specific idea of the environmental policy in this country, in India after the independence, and it will be a very formidable kind of an understanding to hone our strategy to see that how environmental laws have reflected these major policies in India. With this, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.